The soul perceives after death, and much more clearly than when in the body. Marsilio Ficino to Giovanni Cavalcanti, his unique friend. Greetings. I have written you several letters, my dearest friend, in which I have attempted the style of love, which indeed is fitting for our friendship, which in its freedom and purity is no different from that of Socrates and Plato. But now, after loving jests in the Platonic style, for this is how Plato introduces his writings, we must come to serious matters. Listen now to the discussion we had once regarding the mind with those excellent citizens and lawyers, Bernardo Giunghi and Bartolomeo Fortini. There are two main questions which people have about the mind. The first is whether the intellect can be separated from the body, whether it can live and operate once the body has been laid aside. The second is, if it does then understand anything, whether it understands clearly or not. We shall now reply to these questions as briefly as possible, for they and similar ones are discussed at great length in our Theology on the Immortality of the Souls. We admit that the intellect can apprehend many incorporeal things such as God, angels, souls, virtues, numerical proportions, ideas, and universal principles. But just as we cannot distinguish the invisible through sight, so neither can we reflect on things incorporeal through any bodily means, nor can we through a nature confined to body, space, and time, inquire into, seek, discover, or retain those things that are not bound by matter, space, and time. But if the mind, while still in control of the body, becomes collected in itself, so that it may observe some things through itself alone, it follows that when it is separated from the body, it is able to observe much more, and much more easily through its own self. If it can function by itself, then it must also be able to exist and to live by itself. And to take the second question, the mind without the body will observe more clearly what is presented to it for its understanding from within, that the senses now observe what is presented to them from outside to be sensed, and that it will do so at least as much more clearly as sight is more acute, and faster than hearing and the other senses, and as mind is superior to sense, and the objects of mind to the objects of sense. No one who uses the powers of the mind doubts that the mind is superior to sense, for he sees that mind is the judge of the senses, and that being more precious it is granted to fewer things, takes longer to train, and is used less frequently. This shows that the objects of the mind also are more sublime than the objects of the sense, because they are universal, vast, and eternal, whereas those of the sense are particular, limited, and moral. It may be added that the more we concentrate on external sense, the more is the internal sense withdrawn, and vice versa. For he who looks and listens attentively can scarcely imagine at the same time, and he who imagines a great deal scarcely sees or hears what is happening around him. The same relation exists between the imagination and the intellect. The soul in this body has two principal impediments. First, it is drawn into many activities and much agitation, and its different activities weaken and obstruct each other, for it is very hard to apply the mind to different things at the same time. Secondly, the soul is engaged in inferior activities much earlier, more attentively and more often than in higher ones, not only because of the condition of its abysmal dwelling, but also because of the corporal service assigned to men for a time by God, And so it is that when we wish to consider the incorporeal, we function for the most part feebly, and perceive it dimly as through a cloud. But whenever the actions of eating, accumulating, feeling, or imagining either entirely cease or greatly reduced, then the vision of the mind will be correspondingly sharpened, so that whatever is observed by the mind is observed more clearly under the power of this light. Then, indeed, the soul will observe through itself, and it will see that the light of the intellect more clearly than it now sees the light of the senses through the glass windows of the bodily prison. Entirely at peace, it will perceive through its own perfect transparency the highest impressions in the light of the divine sun. So bright is that light that the light of this sun becomes a shadow in comparison. And because it is so clear, it is hidden from the impure eyes, but fully manifest to those that are pure. Nor will the mind then gaze as if it were painted images, but rather at real objects, of which all things are images. When in sleep the workings and movements of the external senses cease, when the imagination, which is fed by the rest of the senses, gathers so much strength that it paints pictures internally which seem to represent what is real. What, therefore, will the intellect, which is so much more powerful than the imagination, do when it has escaped free from the impediments to a far greater extent than the imagination of the dreaming man, and in a pure truth and reason perceives the true principles of everything? Certainly, it will then depict within itself with the greatest precision all that is true, or rather, it will receive the image of all that is true from everywhere. But from where, chiefly? From the mind of minds, from the light of lights. How easily does this come about? Very easily. For because of a natural kinship between the two, visible light instantaneous illumines a transparent substance. As soon as this substance becomes still and pure, such light gives this substance its own form, through which it gives it all the forms of all visible things. In the same way, intelligible, indeed more than intelligible light, which is God, forms that transparent substance of the intellect. As soon as that substance becomes still, I say it gives birth, this substance, its own form, that is the divine, and through this the forms of all things intelligible. And just as God has already imparted his bounteous light, so immediately he imparts life-giving warmth and joy, thus bestowing life, free from death. And just as he has shed into the physical matter light unmixed with darkness, so he has shed light into the mind beyond any limit of time, more which it arises from the currents of time to the stillness of eternity. Moreover, he ever nourishes the mind with goodness to its content, for God draws the desire of the mind to himself by filling it with beauty, and by drawing desire to himself he fulfills it. Where there is good without evil, there is fullness without surfeit, and through infinite goodness there arises infinite capacity. Thus, infinite goodness and beauty, the source of innumerable forms of goodness and beauty, equally attract and fulfill the mind in eternity.